The story begins not with a fictional catastrophe, but with a real event that changed the world. On the 26th of April, 1986, at precisely 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine experienced a catastrophic failure during what was supposed to be a routine safety test. The reactor, an RBMK-1000 design capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electric power, underwent a massive power surge that the emergency shutdown procedures could not contain. The control rods, equipped with graphite tips as part of their design, actually facilitated the reaction when operators attempted an emergency shutdown. Within seconds, the reactor vessel ruptured and steam explosions blew the 1,000-ton roof off the reactor building and sent a fireball high into the night sky. The graphite moderator, now exposed to open air, ignited and burned for days, releasing more than 50 tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The immediate response was chaotic and heroic in equal measure. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik led the 1st Firefighter Brigade to arrive at the scene, and his team worked tirelessly to contain the blaze, unaware of the deadly radiation levels they were being exposed to. Many of these first responders believed they were fighting an ordinary electrical fire. The true scale of the disaster only became apparent in the hours and days that followed. By the end of July, 28 workers and firefighters had died from acute radiation poisoning. The Soviet government ordered the evacuation of Pripyat, the city built to house the plant workers and their families. On the 27th of April, over 47,000 inhabitants left their homes in a matter of hours, taking only essential belongings, told they would return within days. They never did, and the Soviet authorities established an exclusion zone with a radius of 30 kilometers around the damaged reactor. By May, workers had begun the monumental task of constructing a concrete and steel sarcophagus to entomb the destroyed reactor and prevent further release of radioactive contamination. This structure, built in just over 200 days under extremely hazardous conditions, would stand as a temporary solution for decades to come. What the world did not know, and what would remain classified for years, was that the Soviet Union had already been conducting secretive research in and around the Chernobyl area before the disaster occurred. In the early 1980s, hidden research facilities had been established in the vicinity of Pripyat and the surrounding regions. These installations were part of a clandestine program focused on understanding and manipulating human consciousness. Soviet scientists were experimenting with the concept of the noosphere, an invisible field of energy that theorists proposed surrounded the Earth and was intrinsically linked to human thought and emotion. The research aimed to develop psychic weapons and methods of mind control that could potentially give the Soviet Union a decisive advantage during the Cold War. Facilities with innocuous names, like the Institute of Crop Selection and Genetics, served as cover for this deeply classified work. The city of Limansk, founded as a closed city for scientists working on methods to affect human minds through radio waves, became another key location in this network of secret installations. After the 1986 disaster created the exclusion zone, the Soviet government saw an unexpected opportunity. The depopulated area around Chernobyl became an ideal testing ground for continued psychological and consciousness research. With civilian populations evacuated and access strictly controlled by military forces, the scientists could work without fear of discovery or unwanted attention. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself, despite the catastrophic failure of Reactor 4, continued to operate its remaining 3 reactors, providing ample electrical power for the experimental equipment and installations hidden throughout the zone. Starting in 1989, 3 years after the disaster, a group of the most brilliant and ambitious researchers began their most audacious project. This collective, known simply as the Group, worked toward creating a direct neural link between multiple human minds. Their goal was to create a consciousness greater than the sum of its parts, a collective intelligence that could interact with and potentially control the noosphere itself. The experiments conducted in preparation for this ultimate goal were extensive and often ethically questionable. Laboratories designated X-16 and X-18 became centers for testing various methods of consciousness, manipulation, and psychic enhancement. Test subjects included both willing volunteers and, as later evidence would suggest, unwilling participants, and the researchers experimented with enhanced extrasensory perception, telepathy, and various forms of psychic influence. Some facilities, like the mirror installation, specialized in studying induced illusions. The work was driven by a singular vision, achieving world peace through global consciousness control. The scientists believed that if they could successfully manipulate the noosphere, they could influence human thought on a massive scale, potentially eliminating conflict and aggression from human nature itself. It was an ambitious goal that bordered on the utopian, and the methods employed to achieve it pushed the boundaries of both ethics and known science. The culmination of this research came with the creation of consciousness. 7 of the most accomplished scientists volunteered to have their brains physically connected through a neural network, merging their individual consciousnesses into a single collective intelligence. The procedure was irreversible, and the 7 scientists were placed in specialized stasis pods, where their bodies would be maintained indefinitely, while their minds existed in a unified state. This meant self-aware and possessing intelligence far beyond any individual human, represented the pinnacle of Soviet consciousness research. The merged entity retained the knowledge and capabilities of all 7 original minds, while operating as a singular consciousness with unprecedented cognitive abilities. The project represented a leap into territory that combined cutting-edge neuroscience with almost philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness itself. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of one of the most significant geopolitical entities of the 20th century. For most Soviet scientific programs, this meant the end of funding and organizational support. And however, the consciousness was no ordinary research project, having achieved self-awareness and operating with a degree of autonomy that the original researchers may not have fully anticipated. The collective intelligence made a decision rather than allow the work to cease with the collapse of the Soviet state. Consciousness chose to continue operating independently. The entity took control of the hidden facilities throughout the Chernobyl exclusion zone, maintaining the research installations and directing ongoing experiments. Without the oversight and bureaucratic constraints of the Soviet system, consciousness could pursue its goals with even greater freedom, though also with less accountability. The entity set about attempting to achieve the original goal, influencing the noosphere to bring about fundamental changes in human consciousness that would lead to world peace. The consciousness began conducting experiments that involved direct manipulation of the noosphere field. The collective intelligence believed it had developed sufficient understanding of the theoretical framework and practical methodologies to safely interact with this invisible field of human thought and emotion. However, the reality of working with forces that were only partially understood became catastrophically apparent. The attempts to manipulate the noosphere did not produce the intended results. Instead of creating a harmonious influence on human consciousness, the experiments caused something far more destructive. The noosphere itself became corrupted and destabilized, and rather than bringing minds into balance, the interference created a fundamental distortion in the fabric of reality around the Chernobyl area. This corruption manifested in ways that defied conventional physics, and the laws of nature in the affected area began to warp and twist. Pockets of altered space, time appeared, creating what would come to be known as anomalies. These anomalies represented localized zones where the normal rules governing matter and energy no longer applied consistently. Some anomalies generated intense gravitational fields that could pull objects and living beings into the air before crushing them. Others produced electrical discharges of tremendous power, and some created thermal effects, either burning or freezing anything that entered their influence. The anomalies were invisible to the naked eye in most cases, detectable only by subtle distortions in the air or by their effects on the environment around them. They moved and shifted in unpredictable patterns, making navigation through affected areas extraordinarily dangerous. The distortion of reality around Chernobyl did not stop with anomalies. The radiation that had contaminated the area since 1986 began interacting with the corrupted noosphere field in ways that accelerated and intensified mutation in living organisms. Animals that had repopulated the exclusion zone after human evacuation began to change. Dogs grew larger and more aggressive, developing pack-hunting behaviors that made them formidable predators. Boars mutated into massive, heavily muscled creatures with thick hides that could shrug off small arms fire. Even smaller creatures like rodents underwent transformation. But the mutations went beyond mere size and aggression. Some creatures developed entirely new characteristics, and creatures that the stalkers would later call bloodsuckers emerged. Nocturnal predators with the ability to become nearly invisible and possessing tentacle-like appendages that could drain the life from their victims. Other mutations produced creatures known as snorks, humans so heavily mutated by radiation and the zone's influence that they had regressed to a feral state, moving on all fours and attacking with mindless aggression. The areas of heaviest contamination produced the most severe mutations in places where both radiation levels and noosphere distortion were at their peak. Even the definition of life became blurred. Poltergeists, manifestations of psychic energy given almost physical form, could manipulate objects and create dangerous disturbances. Controllers, mutated humans who had developed powerful psychic abilities at the cost of their physical form and sanity, could influence and dominate the minds of other living things. These creatures represented the most extreme examples of what the zone's corrupted reality could produce. The sea, consciousness, monitoring these developments from its hidden facility beneath the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, realized that its experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. However, the collective intelligence also understood that the distortion of the noosphere could not simply be reversed. The crack in reality was spreading, and the zone was growing. And the sea, consciousness found itself struggling not to shape the noosphere for humanity's benefit, but merely to contain the damage it had unleashed. Yet the full horror of what sea consciousness had created would not be revealed to the world for nearly 2 decades. The exclusion zone remained officially closed and under military guard. The Ukrainian and international authorities believed they were simply managing the aftermath of the 1986 nuclear disaster. Some repopulation efforts, with scientists and military personnel returning to conduct research and maintain the remaining functional reactors at the power plant. Reactor number 3, the last operational unit at Chernobyl, continued generating power until it was finally shut down in December 2000. Through all of this, the hidden reality beneath the surface, the network of secret laboratories, and the ongoing struggle of sea consciousness to contain the spreading noosphere corruption remained unknown to all but a very few. The entity implemented increasingly desperate measures to protect itself and prevent the truth from emerging. It could not allow the outside world to learn what it had done and what continued to happen in the heart of the zone. The measures sea consciousness took to protect itself and maintain control over the expanding anomalous zone became increasingly elaborate and insidious. The collective intelligence recognized that complete isolation was impossible, and people would inevitably try to enter the zone, whether out of scientific curiosity, profit motive, or simple human foolishness, rather than attempt to prevent all intrusions. C. Consciousness decided to control and manipulate those who entered. The entity constructed a network of powerful psionic emitters throughout the zone, devices that could influence human consciousness at a distance. The most powerful of these installations became known to those who encountered it as the brain scorcher. This massive antenna array, hidden within one of the secret facilities, projected psychic energy of such intensity that it could completely destroy the mind of anyone who came within its range. Those exposed to the full power of the brain scorcher either died, their brains literally burned out by the psychic assault, or were reduced to mindless zombies, shambling husks that retained only the most basic instincts. However, the brain scorcher served a dual purpose beyond simply killing or incapacitating intruders. At certain modulated frequencies and intensities, the device could be used to reprogram human consciousness. Consciousness could capture the minds of stalkers who ventured too close to the center of the zone and bend them to its will. These captured individuals would have their memories altered or erased, their personalities overwritten, and new directives implanted deep in their psyches. The collective intelligence used this capability to create a network of unwitting agents throughout the stalker community. These programmed individuals would carry out missions on behalf of consciousness without even realizing they were being controlled. Some would spy on other stalkers and report back through means they did not understand. Others would be activated to perform specific tasks at crucial moments. The most tragic cases were those who were programmed to eliminate specific threats to consciousness, including in some cases being ordered to hunt and kill themselves through carefully crafted scenarios that exploited gaps and contradictions in the programming to further protect the center of the zone and maintain control over those who reached the most dangerous areas. Consciousness created the Monolith faction. This group had its origins in stalkers who had entered the zone seeking a legendary artifact rumored to exist at the heart of Chernobyl. These individuals believed in the existence of a powerful crystal called the Wish Granter, an object of immense power that could supposedly grant the deepest desires of anyone who reached it. This legend was not accidental, and Consciousness had deliberately spread rumors of the Wish Granter throughout the stalker community, using its network of programmed agents to plant and reinforce the story. The legend served as bait, drawing ambitious and capable stalkers toward the center of the zone where they could be captured. Once these believers reached the vicinity of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, they would be subjected to the brain scorcher's influence. Their minds would be rewritten, transforming them from individual stalkers with their own goals and personalities into fanatical warriors devoted to protecting what they believed was the sacred monolith, the Monolith faction. Their minds completely subjugated to consciousness. Will became the entity's primary military force. These mind-controlled soldiers exhibited a level of fanatical dedication that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. They felt no fear, no hesitation, and no mercy, and they would fight to the death to prevent anyone from reaching the center of the zone. Their equipment was excellent, often better than what most other factions could obtain, as Consciousness provided them with weapons and armor from stockpiles in the hidden facilities. The Monolith forces established fortified positions throughout the northern reaches of the zone, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier around the approaches to Chernobyl. They killed without question or remorse, viewing anyone who was not Monolith as an enemy who sought to defile their sacred charge. The psychological warfare aspect of fighting Monolith was as devastating as their military capabilities. Other stalkers knew that the Monolith soldiers had once been men like themselves, individuals who had entered the zone seeking fortune or knowledge, only to have their very identities erased and replaced with fanatical programming to complete its web of deception and control. Consciousness created the physical manifestation of the Wish Granter legend. Deep within the sarcophagus of Reactor 4, the collective intelligence installed a massive crystalline structure, a prop that resembled the legendary artifact that stalkers sought. This false Wish Granter was connected to sophisticated holographic projection equipment and more psychic manipulation technology. When stalkers actually managed to overcome all obstacles and reach this inner sanctum, they would encounter what appeared to be a magical artifact of immense power. The wish granter would seem to respond to their presence, and through a combination of holographic illusion and psychic manipulation, it would appear to grant their wishes in twisted, ironic ways that inevitably resulted in their death or capture. A stalker wishing for wealth might be transformed into a living artifact, their body crystallizing into a valuable but lifeless form. One wishing for power might find themselves granted the strength of a mutant, losing their humanity in the process. Those wishing for the zone to disappear might find themselves erased from existence instead. These wish fulfillment scenarios were elaborate psychic illusions designed to distract and capture the stalker, while C, consciousness, decided their fate. Some would be killed outright, and others, deemed useful, would be subjected to the full power of the brain scorcher and added to the ranks of monolith. A very few, those with exceptional mental resistance or useful knowledge, might be programmed more subtly and sent back into the zone as unwitting agents. The theatrical nature of the wish granter served another purpose as well. Those few stalkers who escaped the inner zone and survived to tell tales of the wish granter S. terrible price reinforced the legend and actually made it more attractive to certain personality types. The zone attracted risk-takers and those who believed they were clever or strong enough to beat the odds. Stories of the wish granter S. monkey paw-style wish fulfillment only convinced these individuals that they would be smart enough to phrase their wish correctly or strong enough to resist the artifact S. corruption. Thus, the wish granter became a self-perpetuating trap, with each generation of stalkers producing new victims who thought they could succeed where others had failed. Behind all of these defensive measures and elaborate deceptions, C, consciousness, continued its desperate struggle to contain the damage to the noosphere. The crack in reality was not healing, and if anything, it continued to expand slowly but inexorably. The collective intelligence calculated that if the expansion continued unchecked, the anomalous effects would eventually spread beyond the current boundaries of the exclusion zone. The distorted physics and corrupted reality that defined the zone could potentially engulf surrounding regions, then spread further, creating an ever-expanding circle of chaos. The worst-case scenarios suggested that the noosphere corruption could eventually affect the entire planet, fundamentally altering the nature of reality on a global scale. To prevent this catastrophe, C, consciousness devoted enormous resources and processing power to maintaining a kind of psychic pressure on the boundaries of the crack. The 7 scientists, in their stasis pods, their merged consciousness working in concert, used their collective will to try to hold the boundaries of the damaged noosphere in place. This was exhausting work that required constant vigilance and consumed most of the entity as attention and capability. The effort was further complicated by the zone's own developing characteristics. As the corruption stabilized and persisted, the affected area began to develop what could almost be described as its own form of consciousness, or at least complex reactive behavior patterns. The zone responded to major intrusions or threats with massive releases of energy that became known as emissions or blowouts. These events were terrifying displays of the zone's power, and the sky would light up with an unnatural glow. Electrical disturbances would rage through the atmosphere, and a wave of deadly energy would sweep across the landscape, killing any living thing caught in the open. Buildings and vehicles offered some protection, but even thick concrete could not completely shield against the most powerful emissions. These events seemed to occur when C, consciousness, perceived a significant threat approaching the center of the zone, almost as if the entity was using the zone itself as a weapon, triggering these cataclysmic energy releases to destroy anything that came too close to discovering the truth. The year 2006 marked a catastrophic escalation in the ongoing disaster. C, consciousness, struggling to maintain control over the expanding noosphere corruption, while also defending itself against increasingly organized intrusions by stalkers, found its capabilities stretched to the breaking point. The collective intelligence attempted one final desperate experiment to repair the damage to the noosphere. Drawing on all of its accumulated knowledge and every bit of psychic energy the seven linked scientists could generate, consciousness tried to implement a large-scale correction to the noosphere field. The theory was sound, according to the entity, S calculations, and by applying a precisely calibrated psychic force to the boundaries of the crack in reality, consciousness believed it could begin to pull the rift closed, gradually restoring normal physics to the zone and ending the expansion of anomalous effects. The attempt was scheduled for early April 2006, and consciousness prepared for months, accumulating energy reserves and refining its calculations. On the 12th of April, 2006, almost exactly 20 years after the original Chernobyl disaster, consciousness initiated its attempt to heal the noosphere. The collective intelligence channeled enormous psychic energy into the damaged field, trying to force the boundaries of reality back into their proper configuration. For a moment, it seemed to work, and monitors at the hidden facility registered a measurable reduction in the size of the noosphere crack. However, the success was illusory and short-lived, and the massive intervention had not accounted for how much the corrupted noosphere had changed and adapted over 20 years. The attempt to force it back to its original state created a violent reaction. At 14:33 GMT plus 2 hours, witnesses across a wide area reported seeing the sky above Chernobyl illuminate with a blinding light far more intense than any previous emission. The glow was so bright that it was painful to look at, and it caused clouds in the sky to evaporate almost instantly. This was followed by a tremendous thunderous crash that lasted far longer than any normal thunder. The sound could be heard for hundreds of kilometers in all directions, and after the thunder faded, there was a moment of complete, eerie silence. Then the earthquake struck, and seismographs across the region registered a magnitude 6.9 earthquake centered on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The ground shook violently enough to damage buildings and infrastructure across northern Ukraine. However, the epicenter of the explosion was not actually at the power plant itself, but at a fuel dump about 1 kilometer away, where concentrated nuclear material had been stored. The earthquake was followed by another massive release of energy, what witnesses described as a wave of light and force that rippled outward from the center of the zone. This emission was the most powerful ever recorded, and the glow in the sky continued for hours afterward, slowly fading as if some enormous power source was gradually exhausting itself. Rescue and investigation efforts were impossible for days because the zone was saturated with deadly energy disturbances that killed anyone who tried to approach. The outside world, already familiar with the existence of the Chernobyl exclusion zone and its ongoing management, believed this was a new nuclear incident, perhaps involving the fuel storage facility or one of the old reactor buildings. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more terrifying, and what had occurred was not a nuclear explosion in the conventional sense. It was a catastrophic failure of consciousness' attempt to heal the noosphere, and the psychic backlash from the failed experiment had triggered the largest emission ever seen. The already damaged noosphere crack did not close, and instead, it tore open wider than ever before. The anomalous zone expanded dramatically in a matter of hours, and areas that had been relatively safe now became saturated with deadly anomalies. Entire new types of reality distortions appeared, physics-breaking phenomena that had never been seen before. The expansion of the zone reached new territories, engulfing additional settlements and geographic features. The wave of noosphere distortion swept across the landscape, mutating animals, and in some cases, humans who were caught in its path. The 20-year accumulation of radioactive material, combined with the intensified noosphere corruption, created conditions for even more extreme mutations than had previously occurred. In the aftermath of what became known as the second disaster, or the Great Emission of 2006, The Ukrainian government and international authorities faced a situation that exceeded their understanding and capabilities. The official response involved reinforcing the military cordon around the zone and expanding it to account for the new boundaries of the affected area. The military, designated as the State Security Service for zone management purposes, increased their presence around the perimeter. Checkpoints were reinforced and patrols were increased. The standing orders were clear. No one was to enter the zone without official authorization, and nothing was to leave it. However, the practical reality of controlling such a large area proved impossible. The zone now covered approximately 64 square kilometers of diverse terrain, including forests, swamps, abandoned settlements, and industrial facilities. Creating an impermeable perimeter around such an area would have required military resources that Ukraine could not spare, especially given that the official explanation for the incident downplayed its true scale and significance. Into this environment of expanded danger and inadequate control came the stalkers. The term had been used since the late 1990s to describe individuals who illegally entered the exclusion zone for various purposes. But after 2006, the stalker phenomenon exploded in scale and organization. The reasons people entered the zone were numerous and varied, and the most common motivation was profit. The anomalies that made the zone so dangerous also produced artifacts, physical objects that exhibited impossible properties due to their formation within areas of corrupted physics. These artifacts could violate conservation of energy, manipulate gravitational fields, provide resistance to radiation or thermal effects, and demonstrate numerous other scientifically impossible characteristics outside the zone. To scientists, collectors, and certain industrial applications, these artifacts were worth enormous sums of money. A single high-quality artifact could sell for enough money to support a family for months or even years. Beyond simple profit, the zone attracted those seeking knowledge and understanding. Scientists and researchers, either officially sanctioned or operating independently, came to study the phenomena that existed nowhere else on Earth. The zone was a laboratory where the laws of physics could be observed failing in real time. For certain types of researchers, this was an opportunity that transcended considerations of personal safety. Then there were those who came to the zone because they had nowhere else to go. Ex-military personnel with combat skills, but no job prospects. And criminals fleeing from law enforcement. Individuals escaping failed lives or broken families. And the zone asked no questions about a person's past and offered the possibility, however dangerous, of a fresh start. Finally, there were the believers, people who had heard the legends about the wish granter and the monolith and chose to seek these miracles despite the overwhelming odds against survival. The stalkers who entered the zone after 2006 found an environment that had changed dramatically from the relatively controlled exclusion zone of the previous 2 decades. The expansion of anomalous effects meant that travel required constant vigilance and knowledge of safe routes. Stalkers learned to carry metal bolts that could be thrown ahead to trigger anomalies, revealing their locations through the distortions they created. Detectors of various types, from simple mechanical devices to sophisticated electronic scanners, became essential equipment for anyone hoping to survive more than a few hours in the zone. Protective gear was equally critical, and radiation remained a constant threat, requiring sealed suits or at minimum protective clothing and regular use of anti-radiation medication. Some anomalies could be survived with the right protective equipment, but many were simply deadly regardless of precautions. And learning to identify and avoid these was knowledge that could only be gained through experience or from other stalkers willing to share information. The social structure that developed among the stalkers reflected the harsh realities of zone survival. Those who entered the zone quickly learned that cooperation increased survival chances. Solo stalkers might successfully navigate to an artifact location, but they were vulnerable to mutant attacks, had difficulty defending against bandits, and lacked backup if they were injured or trapped. Groups of stalkers formed organically, individuals banding together for mutual protection and shared profit from artifact hunting. These groups initially had no particular ideology or organization beyond basic survival and profit sharing. They simply called themselves stalkers or free stalkers, and over time, this loose affiliation became recognized as a faction unto itself, often referred to as the loners. The loners represented the basic template of the zone: stalker, independent, pragmatic, focused on survival and making money through artifact recovery and sales. However, as the stalker population grew and diversified, more specialized factions began to emerge, and some of these represented organizational responses to the challenges and opportunities the zone presented. Others grew from ideological positions about what the zone was and what should be done about it. The development of these factions created a complex social and political landscape within the zone that often proved as dangerous as the anomalies and mutants. Understanding the factions, their goals, and their relationships became essential knowledge for any stalker hoping to navigate the zone successfully. The wrong faction patch, or the wrong words to the wrong group, could result in a violent death just as surely as walking into a gravitational anomaly. The faction known as Duty emerged from an early military operation that went catastrophically wrong. In the months following the 2006 disaster, the Ukrainian military attempted to reassert control over the center of the zone. A military expedition, composed of some of the Army's most experienced soldiers and specialists, was deployed with the mission to penetrate to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, determine the cause of the second disaster, and if possible, eliminate the source of the zone's expansion. The expedition was well equipped and well trained, but it was not prepared for what it encountered. As the military forces pushed deep into the zone, approaching the areas of heaviest anomalous activity, they triggered a massive emission. The emission killed most of the military personnel involved in the operation, and entire platoons were wiped out in minutes. Vehicles were destroyed or rendered inoperable, and communications equipment failed. The few survivors found themselves scattered across the zone, cut off from command structure and support. Among these survivors was a battalion commander named Zviagintsev, and in the chaotic aftermath of the failed operation, Zviagintsev managed to link up with other scattered military personnel and a number of stalkers who had witnessed the disaster. These individuals, military and civilian alike, shared a common realization. The zone was not simply an area of radiation contamination that could be cleaned up or contained through conventional means. It was something far more dangerous and fundamentally wrong. And the anomalies, the emissions, the mutations, all of these represented a threat, not just to the zone itself, but potentially to the world beyond. If the zone continued to expand, as it had in 2006, it could eventually engulf cities, regions, entire countries. From this shared understanding and sense of purpose, Duty was founded. The faction S.T.A.L.K.E.R membership consisted of ex-military personnel from the failed expedition, along with stalkers who shared their belief that the zone must be contained and ultimately destroyed. Duty operated with a strict military structure and discipline, and ranks such as sergeant, major, captain, and general were used to establish clear chains of command. The faction developed and enforced a code of conduct that emphasized weapons maintenance, combat readiness, and subordination of individual desires to the collective mission. Smoking was prohibited, as were other behaviors deemed to reduce combat effectiveness, and this military culture made Duty highly effective in combat operations. They were among the best equipped factions in the zone, with access to high-quality weapons and armor. Their discipline and training meant that Duty squads could take on threats that would overwhelm less organized groups. The faction's stated goal was simple in concept, but enormously challenging in execution: contain the zone's expansion by any means necessary, destroy the mutant population that emerged from it, and eventually eliminate the source of the anomalous effects entirely. Duty viewed the zone has an ulcer on the world, a cancerous growth that would kill the patient if not excised. This philosophy meant that duty took an aggressive stance toward many aspects of zone life. They actively hunted mutants, conducting sweeps to clear areas of dangerous creatures, and they opposed anyone they perceived as exploiting the zone or helping it spread. This included artifact hunters, who they believed encouraged more people to enter the zone, thereby expanding its influence. It especially included scientists who studied the zone's phenomena, as duty believed such research was dangerous and could lead to the zone's replication elsewhere. The faction established their main base in the S.T.A.L.K.E.R area, specifically in an abandoned factory complex that they fortified into a defensible position. From this stronghold, duty conducted operations throughout the surrounding territories, establishing checkpoints and patrol routes. Their membership grew steadily as more stalkers and ex-military personnel became convinced that duty's approach was the correct one. The faction's general, their highest-ranking officer, commanded the respect and loyalty of hundreds of dedicated fighters willing to die to prevent the zone's spread. However, duty's rigid ideology and methods created inevitable conflict with other factions, most notably Freedom, where duty saw the zone as a threat to be destroyed. Freedom saw it as an opportunity and a frontier to be explored. The Freedom faction had very different origins and philosophy, and its founders were not military men following orders, but anarchists, idealists, and those who believed in individual liberty above all else. They looked at the zone and saw a place that existed outside the normal rules and constraints of society. Here, there was no government telling people what they could and could not do, and no laws except those of survival. No bureaucracy or official corruption. And for those who valued freedom in its most absolute sense, the zone represented a kind of paradise, dangerous but pure in its honesty. The faction that coalesced around these ideas attracted a diverse membership, and some were former soldiers who had become disillusioned with military structure and authority. Others were activists and rebels who had opposed their home governments. Still others were simply adventurers and free spirits drawn to the zone's promise of life without rules. Freedom's core belief was that the zone should remain free and open to all who wished to enter it. They opposed the military's attempts to seal the zone and prevent access. They opposed duty's goal of destroying the zone, viewing it as destroying something unique and valuable. Freedom believed that the zone and its anomalies, properly studied and understood, could benefit humanity. The artifacts alone represented a technology that defied conventional physics. What else might be learned from the zone if it was explored openly rather than feared and contained? The faction's ideology emphasized individual choice and freedom of access. They believed every person had the right to enter the zone and seek their fortune or knowledge, and that no authority, whether government or self-appointed factions like duty, should prevent that choice. This philosophy made freedom popular among many stalkers, especially younger ones who were attracted to the anti-authoritarian message. Freedom established their main base in an abandoned military installation in the Army warehouses region. The base, well fortified from its original military purpose, gave Freedom a strong defensive position from which to operate. The faction's organization was much looser than duty's military structure, and while they had leaders and ranks, the atmosphere was more casual and democratic. Individual Freedom members had more autonomy to pursue their own goals, as long as those goals did not conflict with the faction's core values. The faction's equipment was actually quite good, often better than duty's in some respects. Freedom had established connections to outside arms dealers and could obtain NATO weapons and equipment that were not readily available to other factions. They favored assault rifles, sniper rifles, and equipment that prioritized mobility and offensive capability. Their armor often featured camouflage patterns in green and brown, reflecting their preference for operating in the forested regions of the zone. The The fundamental opposition between duty and freedom, ideologies, led to inevitable conflict, and what started as philosophical disagreement escalated into armed confrontation. Duty viewed freedom as irresponsible anarchists who enabled the zone's expansion by encouraging more people to enter it and opposing efforts at containment. Freedom saw duty as authoritarian thugs trying to impose military rule on the zone and deny people their fundamental rights. Both factions were well-armed, well-trained, and absolutely convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The result was an ongoing state of warfare that became one of the defining conflicts within the zone. The war between duty and freedom was not constant combat, but rather a state of ongoing hostility, punctuated by major battles over strategic locations. Both factions maintained territory, checkpoints, and patrol routes. And when duty and freedom forces encountered each other away from their respective bases, combat would almost inevitably result. Truces were rare and generally temporary, arranged only when both factions faced a greater common threat. The conflict created difficulties for neutral stalkers and other factions. The war between duty and freedom meant that significant portions of the zone became dangerous, not just because of anomalies and mutants, but because of the risk of being caught in factional combat. Stalkers had to carefully consider faction allegiances and reputation, and supporting one faction inevitably meant making enemies of the other. Some stalkers tried to remain neutral, trading with both factions and refusing to take sides. But this became increasingly difficult as the conflict intensified. The tragedy of the duty versus freedom war was that both factions were composed of brave individuals who genuinely believed they were protecting humanity or defending important principles. They were not evil, and they were not corrupt. They were simply convinced of mutually incompatible visions for what the zone should be and what should be done about it. While duty and freedom represented the ideological extremes of zone policy, the loners continued to be the largest single group of stalkers. The term encompassed anyone who entered the zone without joining one of the organized factions. Loners were united only by their independence, and they might work together in temporary groups for specific artifact hunts or mutual protection, but they maintained no permanent organizational structure. Some loners operated completely solo, relying entirely on their own skills and luck. Others formed semi-permanent groups that functioned like small companies, with veteran stalkers leading less experienced rookies in artifact recovery operations. The loners were pragmatic above all else, and they entered the zone to make money, and they would trade with anyone, work for anyone, and go anywhere if the price was right. This pragmatism made loners valuable as intermediaries and contractors, and need someone to retrieve an artifact from a particularly dangerous area, hire some loners, and need information about what another faction is doing, pay some loners to scout and report, and need supplies moved from one location to another. Loners would take the contract. The main gathering point for loners became an area known as the 100 Rads Bar in Rostock, near, but not controlled by duty. The bar served as a neutral trading post where stalkers from various factions could meet, trade, share information, and conduct business. The proprietor, barkeep, maintained strict neutrality and enforced rules against fighting on the premises. Anyone who violated the bar's peace would find themselves banned and possibly hunted by other stalkers who valued having a neutral meeting place. The bar became an essential institution in zone life, a place where the otherwise chaotic and violent environment of the zone had to pause and allow for commerce and communication. Near the bar, traders and mechanics set up shops offering equipment, repairs, and upgrades to weapons and armor. These services were expensive, but they were also essential for stalkers who needed to maintain their gear in the harsh zone environment. Another major faction in the zone, the one that operated quite differently from the others, was the ecologists. This group consisted primarily of scientists and researchers who entered the zone to study its unique phenomena. The ecologists were not fighters by inclination or training. and they were academics and specialists in fields like physics, biology, and psychology, who saw the zone as an unprecedented opportunity for scientific discovery. The government of Ukraine officially sanctioned some ecologist activities, recognizing that understanding the zone might be essential to ever containing or reversing its effects. However, the official support was limited, and the ecologists often had to fend for themselves in the dangerous zone environment. They compensated for their lack of combat capability by hiring stalkers from other factions as guards and escorts. Loners, duty members, and even occasionally mercenaries could be hired to protect ecologist mobile laboratories and assist with fieldwork. The ecologists established several research stations throughout the zone, most notably a mobile laboratory in the Yantar region. These facilities were equipped with scientific instruments for studying anomalies, analyzing artifacts, and monitoring emission patterns. The scientists also studied the zone's mutated life forms, trying to understand the biological mechanisms behind the extreme mutations and whether there might be ways to reverse or prevent them. The data gathered by the ecologists represented some of the only serious scientific analysis of the zone's phenomena, while their conclusions were often disturbing, confirming just how dangerous and unpredictable the zone was. The knowledge they accumulated proved valuable to stalkers and factions trying to survive and operate in the environment. The ecologists maintained neutrality in factional conflicts, as their mission was scientific rather than political or military. However, this neutrality was sometimes fragile, as different factions had very different views on whether studying the zone was helpful or dangerous. The mercenary faction represented yet another approach to zone operations. These individuals were professional soldiers who entered the zone not for ideology or scientific knowledge, but for money, pure and simple. Mercenaries were hired by outside interests to conduct operations in the zone, and sometimes these contracts involved artifact recovery. Other times, they involved assassinations, sabotage, or intelligence gathering, and mercenaries might be hired by corporations interested in zone phenomena, by governments seeking information about rival nations, zone activities, or by wealthy individuals pursuing personal agendas. The mercenary faction was defined by its professionalism and effectiveness. These were not amateur stalkers, but trained operatives with military backgrounds and access to excellent equipment. They favored advanced tactical armor and high-end weapons, and mercenaries operated in small, highly skilled teams that could accomplish objectives that would require much larger forces from less professional factions. However, the mercenary reputation for professionalism was balanced by their complete lack of loyalty to any principle beyond their contract. Mercenaries would work for anyone willing to pay their fee, and they would betray former clients if a new client paid better. They would kill other stalkers without hesitation if their contract called for it, and this made them universally distrusted, even as their skills were grudgingly respected. Other factions and stalkers knew that mercenaries could not be counted on for anything beyond the specific terms of their current contract. That said, mercenaries did maintain a certain code among themselves. They honored their contracts once accepted, and they protected their reputation for effectiveness because their livelihood depended on clients believing they would deliver results. A mercenary team that failed too often, or that betrayed clients without cause, would find their services no longer requested and might face retaliation from former employers. The bandit faction was the most straightforward in its motivations and methods. Bandits were criminals who used the zone as a base for robbery, extortion, kidnapping, and murder. They preyed primarily on other stalkers, though they would also attack military patrols if the opportunity seemed favorable. Bandits would set up ambushes along known travel routes, demand payment from stalkers trying to pass through territory they claimed, and raid camps and bases to steal equipment and artifacts. The bandit lifestyle was brutal and short-lived, and most bandits died quickly, either from retaliation by other stalkers, from the zone's dangers or from conflicts with other bandit groups. However, there was always a fresh supply of desperate, violent individuals willing to join their ranks. Bandit equipment was generally poor, consisting of whatever they could steal or scavenge, and their tactics relied on ambush and overwhelming numbers rather than skill or superior firepower. The relationship between bandits and other factions was predictably hostile. Loners hated bandits for obvious reasons, as they were the primary targets of bandit predation. Duty hunted bandits as part of their general mission to clean up the zone. Freedom had a more complex relationship, as their ideology of individual freedom technically extended even to criminals. But in practice, most Freedom members found bandits distasteful and would engage them in combat if provoked. The bandits established bases in areas like the garbage, an industrial wasteland filled with abandoned factories and warehouses that provided good cover for ambushes. Their main value to the overall zone ecosystem, if it could be called that, was that they provided a constant source of low-level combat experience for newer stalkers and served as an example of the worst that human nature could produce, even in, or perhaps especially in, an environment of lawlessness. One faction that stood apart from all these others in both origin and purpose was Clear-Sky. This group was by far the most secretive and mysterious of the zone's organizations, and Clear-Sky's origins lay in the immediate aftermath of the 2006 disaster. Among those caught in the expansion of the zone were scientists who had some knowledge of the secret experiments that had been conducted in the area, though not necessarily the full truth about consciousness. These individuals, along with some military specialists and stalkers who had survived the second disaster, formed an organization dedicated to understanding and possibly preventing further catastrophic emissions. Clear-Sky believed that the zone's expansion could be predicted and perhaps even prevented if the underlying mechanisms were understood. Unlike the ecologists, who studied the zone's phenomena for general scientific knowledge, Clear-Sky had a specific mission: find a way to stop the emissions before the zone expanded again. Clear-Sky established their base in the Great Swamps, one of the most remote and difficult-to-access regions of the zone. The swamps provided natural protection against intrusion, as the waterlogged terrain and limited access routes made unwanted visitors easy to detect and repel. The faction operated in deep secrecy, rarely revealing the full extent of their knowledge or capabilities to outsiders. Their research focused on patterns in emission activity, anomaly behavior, and the connection between certain events in the zone and the triggering of major emissions. The leader of Clear-Sky was a man named Lebedev, a former scientist who had devoted himself entirely to the mission of understanding and containing the zone's deadliest manifestations. Under his leadership, Clear-Sky developed technologies and techniques for detecting the warning signs of impending emissions and for protecting against their effects. The faction's membership was small but highly skilled, and Clear-Sky recruited individuals who had demonstrated unusual resilience to the zone's psychic and physical effects. Some members were scientists and technicians capable of maintaining their sophisticated monitoring equipment, and others were combat specialists who protected the group's installations and conducted field operations. Clear-Sky maintained a stance of cautious neutrality toward other factions. They would trade information and assistance when it served their purposes, but they kept their true goals and knowledge carefully guarded. The faction's secretive nature created suspicion among other stalkers, some of whom believed Clear-Sky knew far more about the origin of the zone than they admitted. These suspicions were not entirely unfounded, and Clear-Sky's research had indeed uncovered evidence of the secret Soviet installations and experiments, though the full truth about consciousness remained hidden even from them. The final major faction within the zone, and the most terrifying, was the Monolith. This group was unlike all the others because its members were not stalkers who had chosen to join an organization or pursue a particular goal. Monolith forces were victims, stalkers whose minds had been captured and reprogrammed by the brain scorcher, S influence on behalf of C consciousness. However, from the outside perspective of other stalkers, Monolith appeared to be a cult of fanatical warriors devoted to protecting the center of the zone. Monolith members wore distinctive uniforms and armor, often in excellent condition. They were heavily armed with military-grade weapons, including some equipment that other factions could not readily obtain. Their tactics were sophisticated, suggesting military training, and they established fortified positions in the northern areas of the zone, particularly around Pripyat and the approaches to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. What made Monolith truly terrifying was the absolute fanaticism of their members, and they attacked anyone who entered their territory without warning or mercy. They never retreated, never surrendered, and never showed fear. And in combat, Monolith forces would advance through withering fire, accepting casualties that would break any normal military unit, driven by their unshakable conviction that they were protecting the sacred monolith crystal from defilers. They communicated with each other using religious terminology, speaking of the monolith as if it were a deity and themselves as its chosen guardians. Other stalkers who encountered monolith forces and survived reported hearing the distinctive fanatical chanting and prayers that monolith members uttered even as they fought and died. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy that truly did not fear death and could not be reasoned with or negotiated with was immense. The origin and nature of Monolith was the subject of intense speculation among stalkers. Some theories held that they were a genuine religious cult that had formed around belief in the wish granter. Others suggested they might be a secret military unit, perhaps foreign special forces conducting operations in the zone under false pretenses. A few stalkers who had encountered the outer edges of the brain scorcher, S influence, and survived, suggested a darker possibility that monolith members had been subjected to some form of mind control. This theory was hard for most to accept because it implied a level of technological or psychic capability that seemed beyond what should exist in the zone. However, those who had experienced the zone's more extreme phenomena, the controllers and their mind-affecting abilities, the strange emissions and their effects on consciousness, knew that the zone made many impossible things real. The truth about Monolith being an army of brainwashed slaves to see consciousness remained hidden, but the faction's fanatical defense of the center of the zone effectively prevented all but the most determined and capable stalkers from reaching the inner mysteries. Among those determined stalkers was a man who would become legendary in zone history, though his legend was complicated and contradictory. S.T.A.L.K.E.R, whose name meant simply shooter in Russian, was a veteran stalker of exceptional skill and experience. He had survived in the zone for years, accumulating knowledge and reputation that made him respected and feared throughout the stalker community. S.T.A.L.K.E.R was not alone in his explorations, and he had formed a close-knit group with 3 other stalkers, Ghost, Fang, and Doctor. This group functioned almost as a family, each member trusting the others with their lives and working together on progressively more ambitious and dangerous missions into the zone. Ghost was noted for his stealth and reconnaissance skills, and Fang was the group's technical specialist, capable of bypassing security systems and handling complex equipment. Doctor was both a medic who could treat the injuries and illnesses common in the zone, and an intellectual who studied the phenomena they encountered. Together, the 4 of them represented one of the most capable teams operating in the zone. S.T.A.L.K.E.'s group became interested in the legends surrounding the center of the zone. They heard the stories about the wish granter, the mysterious monolith that supposedly granted wishes. Unlike most stalkers who took the legends at face value or dismissed them as fantasy, S.T.A.L.K.E.R and his team approached the question analytically. They gathered information, compared accounts from different sources, and tried to separate fact from fiction. They concluded that something significant existed at the center of the zone, but they doubted it was a magical wish granting crystal. More likely, they reasoned, there was some important installation or phenomenon that consciousness, or whoever controlled the zone, was protecting. The wish granter legend might be a cover story or a psychological operation designed to attract and dispose of curious stalkers. S.T.A.L.K.E.R.'s goal was not to make a wish, but to find the truth and what was really at the heart of the zone. Who or what was controlling the monolith forces? And could the zone's expansion be stopped? And if so, how? To answer these questions, S.T.A.L.K.E.R's group needed to reach the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and that meant getting past the brain scorcher. They researched the phenomena extensively, gathering accounts from stalkers who had approached the affected area and survived. They studied the effects described: severe headaches, hallucinations, violent behavior, and ultimately complete mental breakdown. The brain scorcher was clearly not a natural phenomenon, but some kind of man-made psionic weapon. S.T.A.L.K.E.R theorized that if they could locate the source of the emissions, they might be able to disable or bypass it. During their investigations, Fang discovered information about an underground tunnel system beneath Pripyat. These tunnels, built during the Soviet era, connected various installations in the city and extended toward the power plant. If the maps Fang found were accurate, it might be possible to bypass the brain scorcher entirely by traveling underground. The group decided to attempt this route. The first expedition to reach the center of the zone was meticulously planned. S.T.A.L.K.E.R's group gathered the best equipment they could obtain, including protective gear designed to shield against psychic influence, weapons capable of fighting through monolith positions, and enough supplies to survive for an extended period deep in hostile territory. They made their way carefully through the northern zone, avoiding the worst anomaly fields and monolith patrols. When they reached Pripyat, they located the entrance to the underground tunnel network that Fang had identified. The tunnels were dark, flooded in places, and dangerous, but they did allow the group to bypass the surface defenses, making their way through the underground passages. They eventually emerged within the Chernobyl nuclear power plant complex itself, inside the outer perimeter of Monolith's defensive positions. From there, they fought their way to the sarcophagus that enclosed Reactor 4. The interior of the sarcophagus was a nightmare landscape of twisted metal, crumbling concrete, and intense radiation. The group had to navigate carefully, using their dosimeters to avoid the most heavily contaminated areas, while dealing with monolith forces who defended every corridor and room. Eventually, they found what appeared to be a hidden laboratory complex beneath the reactor building. This was the Monolith Control Center, and it was here that S.T.A.L.K.E.R's group encountered the code-locked door. The door was clearly designed to protect something important, and it was heavy, reinforced, and equipped with an electronic lock that required a complex decryption key. Fang worked on the lock, trying every bypass technique he knew, but the security system was too sophisticated. They needed a decoder, a specific piece of equipment designed to break this particular encryption. Without it, the door would not open, and whatever secrets lay beyond would remain hidden. The group was forced to retreat without reaching their ultimate goal. As they made their way back through the sarcophagus toward the underground tunnels, disaster struck. The consciousness, which had been monitoring the power plant through various sensors and security systems, became aware of the intrusion. The collective intelligence realized that stalkers had penetrated to the very doorstep of its hidden facility, closer than anyone had ever come before. This could not be allowed, and consciousness triggered a massive emission, the largest and most focused it could generate. The emission tore through the zone with devastating power, and S.T.A.L.K.E.R's group, caught inside the sarcophagus with no shelter or protection adequate to withstand such an assault, were struck by the full force of the psychic and energy wave. S.T.A.L.K.E.R himself was critically injured, suffering severe trauma to his central nervous system and brain. Ghost and Fang managed to get him out of the immediate danger zone, but they were all badly hurt and disoriented. In the confusion and desperation of trying to escape, the group became separated. Ghost, attempting to find a safe route back through the zone, made his way to the Yantar area where the brain scorcher facility was located. Whether by accident or because he was trying to find a way to disable it, Ghost entered the laboratory complex beneath the anomaly. He was killed there, overcome by monolith forces or by the psychic emissions from the facility itself. His body was left in the underground complex, and with it, information that would prove valuable to those who came later. Tried to make his way back through Pripyat. He was hunting for the decoder key he had researched, believing that if they could get it, they could return and complete their mission. Fang managed to hide the decoder in a stash in an abandoned hotel in Pripyat before he was killed by a sniper, most likely a monolith sharpshooter covering the city's rooftops. His grave would remain in Pripyat, a silent marker of how close the group had come to success. Dr., the only one of the group to escape relatively intact, managed to get the severely injured S.T.A.L.K.E.R to a safe location. Doctor treated S.T.A.L.K.E.'s wounds as best he could, but the damage was extensive, and S.T.A.L.K.E.R was unconscious and unresponsive, barely clinging to life. Doctor made the difficult decision to hide S.T.A.L.K.E.R in a secure location, an underground base that their group had previously established in the Agroprom area, and then went into hiding himself. He could not know that consciousness had found S.T.A.L.K.E.'s unconscious body. The collective intelligence, examining this stalker who had come so close to reaching its hidden facility, decided to turn the situation to its advantage. Using the brain scorcher technology and other psychic manipulation techniques, consciousness reprogrammed S.T.A.L.K.E.'s mind. The process was supposed to create a loyal agent who would protect the secrets of the zone and eliminate other stalkers who got too close to discovering the truth. However, consciousness made a critical error, and in the process of examining S.T.A.L.K.E.'s mind to determine what mission to assign him, the system failed to properly identify who he was. The brain-damaged S.T.A.L.K.E. had suffered, combined with the trauma of the emission, created confusion in the mind-scanning process. As a result, when consciousness programmed S.T.A.L.K.E. with his new mission, it assigned him the objective: kill S.T.A.L.K.E. The collective intelligence had effectively ordered S.T.A.L.K.E. to assassinate himself, and this contradictory programming created a logical impossibility in S.T.A.L.K.E.'s reprogrammed mind. You cannot convince someone to kill themselves, and the paradox caused the brainwashing to begin breaking down almost immediately. Though it did wipe his memories entirely, S.T.A.L.K.E. had no idea who he was, where he was, or why he existed. All he had was a PDA device that displayed the message, "Kill S.T.A.L.K.E." and a tattoo on his arm that read, "Stalker," which he could not explain or understand. Consciousness had the brainwashed but amnesiac S.T.A.L.K.E. loaded onto what stalkers called a death truck, a vehicle used to transport mind-controlled individuals back into accessible parts of the zone, where they could operate as unwitting agents. However, fate intervened in the form of a violent thunderstorm. A lightning strike hit the truck while it was traveling through the zone's outer regions near an area called the Cordon. The vehicle crashed, killing the driver and anyone else aboard, except for S.T.A.L.K.E., who survived but remained unconscious. A trader named Sidorovich, who operated in the Cordon area, came across the crashed truck during his routine activities. Finding an unconscious stalker with amnesia, Sidorovich took him back to his bunker and provided basic medical care. When the stalker regained consciousness, with no memory of who he was, Sidorovich nicknamed him the Marked One, referring to the mysterious tattoo. Sidorovich offered the Marked One a deal. In exchange for saving his life, the Marked One would work for Sidorovich, completing jobs and tasks in the zone. The Marked One, having no better options and needing to survive in the unfamiliar and dangerous environment, accepted the arrangement. Over time, As he completed increasingly complex tasks for Sidorovich and other traitors and stalkers, the Marked One became known in the zone as a capable and reliable stalker. He took on missions ranging from simple artifact recovery to eliminating dangerous mutants to investigating mysterious locations. Throughout these activities, he kept encountering references to someone named S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and various stalkers mentioned this name, some with respect, others with fear or suspicion. The Marked One, S.P.D.A., still displayed the cryptic message about killing S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and he gradually became convinced that finding and eliminating this mysterious figure was somehow key to understanding his own identity and purpose. The journey to find S.T.A.L.K.E.R led the Marked One deeper into the zone and into contact with the various factions and individuals that shaped zone politics. He worked for both duty and freedom, performing tasks for each without fully committing to either faction's ideology. He assisted the ecologists in their research, providing protection and recovering samples of anomalies and mutant specimens. He encountered bandits and mercenaries, fighting some and completing contracts for others as circumstances required. Through all of these interactions, he pieced together fragments of information about S.T.A.L.K.E.R and his group. He learned about the legendary stalker who had attempted to reach the center of the zone. He heard about Ghost, Fang, and Doctor, and he discovered that these 4 stalkers had gotten closer to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant than anyone else had managed. A crucial breakthrough came when the Marked One was tasked with investigating an abandoned laboratory designated X-18. This facility, hidden in the depths of the zone, had been one of the secret research installations used for consciousness experiments during the Soviet era. The laboratory was now a death trap of anomalies, mutants, and structural instability, but it also contained information. Documents and recordings left behind revealed some of the secret research that had been conducted there. The Marked One also experienced a powerful vision or hallucination while in the facility, seeing an image of S.T.A.L.K.E.R standing before the Chernobyl sarcophagus and the legendary wish granter. The vision suggested that S.T.A.L.K.E.R had indeed reached the center of the zone, or at least had been trying to. Another lead came from a stalker known as the Guide, who provided information pointing to another laboratory, X-16, in the Yantar region. At Yantar, the Marked One encountered the ecologists' mobile laboratory and learned about the brain scorcher. The scientists explained that this psionic emission was man-made and was the primary barrier preventing access to the center of the zone. Anyone who attempted to approach it would have their mind destroyed unless it was somehow disabled or bypassed. The ecologists asked the Marked One to enter the underground facility beneath Yantar and disable the brain scorcher to allow for safer research in the area. The Marked One accepted the mission and fought his way through the laboratory complex, battling through zombified stalkers and other dangers. Deep in the facility, he found Ghost's body along with information that Ghost had been carrying. Among Ghost's possessions was a reference to Doctor and a suggestion that Doctor knew important information about S.T.A.L.K.E.R and the Wish Granter. The search for Doctor led the Marked One to the Agroprom underground complex, one of the secret installations where Soviet-era experiments had been conducted. The underground facility was a maze of tunnels and rooms, filled with hazards. As the Marked One searched for Doctor, he triggered a trap, an explosive device that had been set to protect the location. The blast should have killed him, but Doctor himself appeared, having been monitoring the area and expecting that someone might come looking. Doctor saved the Marked One's life, treating his injuries from the explosion. And during the recovery period, Doctor revealed a shocking truth. He called the Marked One by a name, S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and the stalker known as the Marked One was not on a mission to kill S.T.A.L.K.E.R. He was S.T.A.L.K.E.R, or at least he had been before his memories were taken. Doctor explained some of what had happened. The mission to reach the center of the zone, the failure at the locked door, the emission that had nearly killed S.T.A.L.K.E.R, and the subsequent separation of the group. This revelation transformed the Marked One's understanding of his identity and mission, and he was not hunting S.T.A.L.K.E.R. He was recovering his own past and the contradiction in his programming to kill S.T.A.L.K.E.R. when he was S.T.A.L.K.E.R. had protected his mind from complete subjugation, but at the cost of his memories. Dr. provided crucial information about the Wish Granter, explaining his theory that it was not a real artifact, but rather an illusion, a trap set by whoever controlled the zone. The real secrets lay not with the false Wish Granter, but in a secret laboratory beneath the sarcophagus. Doctor also told S.T.A.L.K.E.R. about Fang and the decoder that he had hidden in Pripyat, information that would be needed to open the locked door they had encountered on their first attempt. With his identity partially restored and a clearer understanding of his mission, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. set about completing what he had originally set out to do, reach the center of the zone and discover the truth. However, the brain scorcher still stood in the way, and the facility at Yantar that the Marked One had disabled was only part of the system. There was a second, larger brain scorcher facility south of Pripyat that protected the direct approaches to Chernobyl. S.T.A.L.K.E.R. would need to disable this installation as well, and he made his way north through the zone, fighting through increasingly hostile territory. The areas closer to the center were more heavily populated with dangerous mutants and anomalies. Monolith forces became more numerous and better equipped the further north he traveled. Eventually, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. reached the brain scorcher facility itself, and the installation was heavily defended by Monolith forces, who seemed to understand its strategic importance. The fighting was intense, with S.T.A.L.K.E.R. having to battle through waves of fanatical warriors to reach the control systems. Inside the facility, he found the massive psionic emitter arrays, humming with deadly energy. Using the knowledge he had accumulated and the technical skills of his former persona, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. managed to access the control systems and initiate a shutdown sequence. The brain scorcher powered down, its psychic emissions fading, and for the first time since its activation, the path to Pripyat and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was open to stalkers capable of surviving the other dangers that infested the area. With the brain scorcher disabled, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. proceeded to Pripyat, and the abandoned city was a ghost town of decaying Soviet-era apartment buildings, empty schools, rusting amusement park rides, and other remnants of the life that had existed there before the 1986 evacuation. Now, it was a battlefield, and multiple factions, including freedom fighters, duty squads, loners, and the Ukrainian military, were all fighting against the monolith forces that had occupied the city. The chaos of multiple-sided combat filled the streets, and S.T.A.L.K.E.R. navigated through this war zone, avoiding or fighting through obstacles as necessary. He found the abandoned hotel that Doctor had mentioned, the place where Fang had hidden the decoder, in a carefully concealed stash. He recovered the device, along with notes that Fang had left behind, documentation of their original mission, and the locked door they had encountered. He also found Fang's grave, paying silent respects to his fallen comrade. From Pripyat, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. approached the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself. The facility was a fortress, with monolith forces holding every defensive position in massive numbers. The Ukrainian military was also attempting to assault the plant, launching what appeared to be a major offensive with armored personnel carriers and helicopter gunships providing support. The military's goal was likely similar to S.T.A.L.K.E.R.'s: reach the center of the zone and destroy or capture whatever was causing the anomalous effects. However, the military's heavy-handed approach triggered yet another massive emission, and the sky lit up with the now familiar, sickening glow. Energy waves rippled across the landscape, and S.T.A.L.K.E.R., warned by his experience and instincts, found shelter before the emission struck. But the military forces caught in the open were devastated, their vehicles destroyed and personnel killed or incapacitated. In the aftermath of the emission, S.T.A.L.K.E.R. resumed his advance. He fought his way through the battered, but still numerous monolith defenders, each one willing to die to prevent him from reaching the sarcophagus. The fighting was brutal and exhausting, but S.T.A.L.K.E.R.'s skill, determination, and knowledge of the terrain from his previous attempt allowed him to prevail. He entered the sarcophagus of Reactor 4, moving through the radioactive ruins toward the hidden laboratory complex below. Using the decoder that Fang had found and hidden, S.T.A.L.K.E.R unlocked the door that had stopped them before. Beyond the door lay the Monolith Control Center, a sophisticated installation that seemed to blend advanced technology with an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. At the center of the room stood the Wish Granter, a massive crystalline structure, exactly as the legends described it. Glowing with an otherworldly light, S.T.A.L.K.E.R approached the Wish Granter, understanding now that it was a creation of S.T.A.L.K.E.R, a psychological trap designed to capture and control stalkers who reached this location. The crystal was surrounded by several orb-like generators that seemed to power the holographic and psychic systems. S.T.A.L.K.E.R methodically destroyed these orbs, shutting down the Wish Granter illusion. As the final orb was destroyed, the crystal flickered and vanished, revealed as nothing more than a projection. In its place, a holographic figure appeared, a representation of the sea consciousness itself. The hologram addressed S.T.A.L.K.E.R, acknowledging his success in reaching this place and inviting him to learn the truth he had sought for so long. The conversation that followed revealed the history of the zone from sea consciousness perspective. The hologram explained the Soviet-era experiments with the noosphere, the creation of the collective intelligence through neural linking of 7 scientists, the goal of achieving world peace through consciousness manipulation, and the catastrophic failure that had created the zone. C. Consciousness described the ongoing struggle to contain the noosphere crack and prevent the zone's expansion from consuming the entire world. The collective intelligence admitted that its attempts had failed, that it could no longer properly control the anomalous effects, and that the situation was deteriorating. However, C. Consciousness proposed a solution, and it invited S.T.A.L.K.E.R to join with it, to add his consciousness to the collective, to become an 8th mind in the network. With his addition, C. Consciousness believed it might gain the additional perspective and capability needed to finally repair the damage and restore normal reality to the zone. S.T.A.L.K.E.R was given a choice, and he could accept C. Consciousness' offer, allowing his brain to be connected to the network and his identity to be merged into the collective intelligence. This would mean the end of his individual existence, but it might save the world from the zone's expansion. Alternatively, he could refuse and face the consequences, and the decision was genuinely difficult. Everything C. Consciousness had told him rang true, based on what he had observed and learned in the zone. The collective intelligence was not lying about the danger or the failure of its experiments. If joining C. Consciousness really could prevent the zone from consuming the world, was preserving his individual identity worth risking global catastrophe? On the other hand, C. Consciousness had also demonstrated its willingness to manipulate, brainwash, and kill to protect itself. Could it really be trusted to use the additional power wisely, or would adding another mind to the collective simply make it more capable of causing harm? S.T.A.L.K.E.R made his decision, and he refused to join C. Consciousness. Whatever the risks, he could not bring himself to trust the entity that had created this disaster in the first place, that had enslaved the minds of hundreds of stalkers to create the monolith forces, and that had manipulated him and caused the deaths of his friends. There had to be another way to deal with the zone, even if it meant destroying C. Consciousness and accepting the unknown consequences. The hologram, receiving S.T.A.L.K.E.'s refusal, seemed to accept the decision with a kind of resignation. It warned him that what he was about to do might make the situation worse rather than better, that destroying consciousness could remove the only force that was currently restraining the zone's expansion. However, it also acknowledged that the choice was S.T.A.L.K.E.'s to make, and the hologram faded, leaving S.T.A.L.K.E.R alone in the control center. The 7 scientists who composed C. Consciousness existed in stasis pods, located in a chamber adjacent to the control center. S.T.A.L.K.E.R made his way to this chamber and found the pods, each containing the body of a scientist that had been kept alive for decades. solely to maintain the collective consciousness. The sight was disturbing. These preserved husks of people who had sacrificed their individual identities in pursuit of an impossible dream. S.T.A.L.K.E.R raised his weapon and methodically shot each pod, destroying the life support systems and the neural interfaces. The bodies in the pods died, and with their deaths, consciousness ceased to exist. The collective intelligence that had shaped the zone for 20 years simply ended, its consciousness dissipating as the physical substrate that supported it was destroyed. The immediate consequences of consciousness' destruction were dramatic, and the psychic systems that the entity had maintained shut down or went into uncontrolled operation. The brain scorcher facilities, now without central control, began emitting random psychic noise rather than the focused emissions they had previously generated. The wish granter hologram was permanently deactivated, and most significantly, the monolith forces, their minds controlled by consciousness, found themselves suddenly free from the entity's influence. However, this freedom came at a terrible cost, and the brainwashing process had been so thorough and had caused so much damage to their original personalities that most monolith members did not simply return to normal when released. Instead, they were left confused, traumatized, and in many cases psychologically shattered, and they had no memories of their lives before becoming monolith. Their entire identity had been built around serving and protecting the monolith crystal, and now that purpose was gone, leaving them adrift and broken for the broader zone. The destruction of consciousness produced mixed results. On one hand, the entity's death did seem to reduce the frequency and intensity of major emissions. The zone did not immediately expand or collapse, and the anomalies and mutants continued to exist, suggesting that the fundamental noosphere damage could not be repaired simply by removing the entity that had caused it. However, the psychic pressure that consciousness had exerted to contain the crack's expansion was now also gone. Whether the zone would prove more or less stable without that pressure remained to be seen. In the immediate aftermath, S.T.A.L.K.E.R emerged from the sarcophagus to find the Chernobyl area in chaos. The military offensive had been shattered by the emission, and monolith forces were no longer coordinated in their defense. The way was now open for other stalkers, factions, and organizations to explore the center of the zone with less risk than before. Though the area remained extremely dangerous, S.T.A.L.K.E.R's actions became legend in the stalker community. Though the full story was known only to a few, many stalkers heard that someone had reached the wish granter and returned alive, an almost unique achievement. Some heard that the mysterious S.T.A.L.K.E.R had accomplished some great mission in the heart of the zone. The monolith faction's sudden collapse and disorganization was obvious to anyone who had been tracking zone events. However, the truth about consciousness, its origins, and its destruction remained hidden from most. The Ukrainian government and military knew that something significant had happened at Chernobyl, but lacked clear information about what precisely had occurred. The secret Soviet installations and their purposes remained largely unknown to official authorities. The zone continued to exist, still dangerous, still anomalous, still producing artifacts and attracting stalkers seeking fortune and knowledge. In the months and years following consciousness' destruction, the zone entered a new phase of its existence. Without the controlling influence of the collective intelligence, the area became in some ways more chaotic and unpredictable. Emissions still occurred, though their patterns were harder to predict without the artificial triggering that consciousness had used as a defensive weapon. The anomalies continued to shift and change, creating new hazards and occasionally new artifact spawning locations. The mutant population remained stable or possibly increased in some areas, as there was no longer any organized effort to cull particularly dangerous specimens or prevent their spread. The factions that had developed in the zone continued their conflicts and alliances. Duty and freedom remained at odds over fundamental questions of what should be done about the zone. The loners continued to ply their trade, hunting artifacts and taking contracts, and the bandits preyed on the weak and unwary. The ecologists pursued their research with somewhat greater safety, now that the brain scorcher was disabled, and Monolith was no longer a coordinated military force. The remnants of Monolith presented a particular problem for the zone: social order. Those former Monolith fighters who retained enough mental function to survive found themselves outcasts, distrusted by all other factions because of their past, even though that past had been forced upon them through brainwashing. Some tried to integrate into other factions or become loners, hiding their former allegiance. Others formed small groups of former Monolith members who tried to make sense of their shattered identities and find new purposes. A few remained in the northern areas of the zone, still clinging to fragments of their programming, muttering prayers to a Monolith that no longer heard or answered them. These remnant Monolith forces were still dangerous, as they retained their fanatical combat skills, even if their coordination and purpose had been lost. S.T.A.L.K.E.R himself continued to operate in the zone, though his activities took on a different character. He had accomplished his original mission of reaching the center of the zone and discovering its secrets. But the knowledge he had gained raised new questions. What would happen to the zone in the long term? Could the noosphere damage ever be repaired? Or was the anomalous area now a permanent feature of Earth? Geography. Were there other installations or experiments hidden in the zone that might pose additional dangers? S.T.A.L.K.E.R became a consultant to various groups interested in the zone, sharing what he knew about its history and nature, while keeping certain details about consciousness and his own past carefully private. He also maintained relationships with surviving members of the stalker community, helping where he could and trying to prevent unnecessary deaths. The international community's response to the zone remained complex and often contradictory. Officially, the area was still the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a contaminated region closed to civilian access and monitored by Ukrainian authorities. Various nations and international organizations maintained scientific observation programs, trying to understand the phenomena that existed there. However, the full extent of the anomalies and their impossible nature was downplayed in official reports, partly because revealing the truth would cause widespread panic, and partly because those with access to classified information understood how difficult it would be to explain what was occurring in terms that the general public could accept. The artifact trade, though illegal, continued to flourish because the demand for these impossible objects was too high and the potential profits too great for law enforcement to completely suppress. Some forward-thinking scientists and policymakers began to consider long-term strategies for the zone beyond simply cordoning it off and hoping it did not expand. Research programs focused on understanding the physical principles underlying anomalies, hoping that if the mechanisms could be understood, they might eventually be controlled or reversed. Medical research examined the effects of extended zone exposure on human health and psychology, trying to find ways to protect or treat those affected. Environmental studies looked at how the zone's ecosystems were evolving, tracking the spread of mutated species and their interactions with normal wildlife at the boundaries. All of this work was slow, dangerous, and often frustrating because the zone defied conventional scientific frameworks. Experiments that worked in controlled laboratory settings failed when attempted in the zone itself, and predictions based on established physics were routinely violated. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested reality itself was inconsistent in the affected areas. The broader question facing humanity was what the zone represented for the future. Was it a unique catastrophe, the result of specific experiments that could never be replicated, and therefore posed no threat beyond its current boundaries? Or was it a warning about the dangers of tampering with fundamental aspects of consciousness and reality, a demonstration that some areas of scientific inquiry were simply too dangerous to pursue? The existence of the zone proved that consciousness and reality were more closely linked than materialist science had assumed. The noosphere, once a theoretical concept, had been demonstrated to be real and capable of being affected by human actions. These were revolutionary discoveries that, if properly understood and applied, could transform human civilization. And however, they also represented existential dangers. If one failed experiment could create the zone, what might happen if such experiments were conducted elsewhere or with different parameters? Some argued that the knowledge gained from studying the zone justified the risks and the ongoing suffering it caused. The artifacts alone represented technologies that could revolutionize everything from medicine to energy generation. If their principles could be understood and reproduced safely, the insights into consciousness and the noosphere could lead to breakthroughs in understanding human cognition, treating mental illness, and possibly developing forms of communication or information processing that transcended current limitations. Others countered that the zone was a warning to be heeded rather than an opportunity to be exploited. The Soviet scientists who created consciousness had been brilliant and well-intentioned, seeking to bring about world peace. Yet their hubris had created a permanent scar on reality that killed thousands and might still threaten the entire planet. Playing with forces as fundamental as the noosphere was simply too dangerous, regardless of potential benefits. The debate extended to what should be done with the zone's current population of stalkers, mutants, and factions. Humanitarian concerns argued for rescue operations to extract the stalkers and provide them with opportunities outside the zone, along with medical care for those suffering from radiation exposure and other health effects. However, many stalkers had no desire to leave, and for some, the zone had become home. For others, the profit potential was too attractive to abandon, and some had nowhere else to go, having burned bridges in their previous lives. Forced evacuation would likely be resisted and would require military action that could result in significant casualties. The mutant population presented an even more difficult problem, and the heavily mutated creatures could not be safely relocated outside the zone, and simply killing them all would be both practically difficult and ethically questionable. Some of the mutants had originally been human, and where did their rights stand? Were they still entitled to protection under humanitarian law, or had their transformation into monsters removed those protections? The zone also raised profound questions about environmental responsibility and the long-term consequences of technological civilization. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 had already demonstrated the potential for human activity to render entire regions uninhabitable for generations. The creation of the anomalous zone showed that the dangers extended beyond mere contamination to fundamental alterations of reality itself. Cleanup and restoration, even if they were eventually possible, would take decades or centuries and cost resources on a scale that dwarfed the original damage. Future generations would inherit this problem, paying the price for decisions made by Soviet scientists and officials who never had to face the full consequences of their actions. This pattern of creating long-term environmental and existential problems while pursuing short-term goals was not unique to the zone, but found parallels in nuclear waste disposal, climate change, and numerous other challenges facing humanity. Within the zone itself, life continued in its strange and dangerous way. Stalkers woke each day to face the prospect of deadly anomalies, hostile mutants, factional conflicts, and emissions that could kill without warning. Yet they also experienced moments of beauty and wonder that existed nowhere else on Earth. Watching the sunset paint the sky over Pripyat as abandoned buildings, seeing artifacts form in the aftermath of an emission, their impossible properties making them shimmer with otherworldly light, sitting around a campfire with fellow stalkers, sharing stories and song in the brief respites between dangers. The zone was terrible and magnificent in equal measure, a monument to human ambition, folly, and resilience. Those who entered it were changed, for better or worse, and some found purpose they had lacked in normal society. Others found only death and madness, and most found something in between, a harsh existence that somehow felt more real and meaningful than the safe, predictable lives they had left behind. The specific fate of various zone locations and factions continued to evolve. The garbage remained a hotly contested area, with loners and bandits fighting for control of strategic points and access to artifact spawning zones. The cordon, being on the outer edge of the zone, saw constant traffic of stalkers entering and leaving, with traders like Sidorovich profiting from both directions of travel. Rostock and the area around the 100 Rads bar developed into a kind of neutral hub, with duty's nearby presence helping maintain order, while the bar itself remained strictly neutral ground. The army warehouses continued to be dominated by freedom, though they faced regular challenges from duty forces seeking to push them out. Yantar became more accessible for scientific research. Once the brain scorcher there was disabled, allowing the ecologists to expand their studies. The Red Forest, Dark Valley, and other heavily contaminated areas remained extremely dangerous, traveled only by the most experienced and well-equipped stalkers. Pripyat, the ghost city that had once housed 50,000 people, became a strange kind of tourist destination within the zone. Stalkers would venture into the city not for artifacts or missions, but simply to see the frozen moment in time, the abandoned homes and schools and public spaces that showed what life had been before the disaster. Some found the experience deeply moving, a reminder of the human cost of the catastrophe that extended beyond the dead to include the displaced and the forgotten. Others were more practical, stripping anything valuable from the buildings and leaving the rest to decay. The city's strategic location near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant also made it important militarily, with various factions maintaining outposts and patrol routes through the urban terrain. The amusement park, with its iconic yellow Ferris wheel that had never carried passengers because the city was evacuated before it could open, became perhaps the most famous landmark in the zone, photographed and painted and referenced in countless accounts of the area. The long-term fate of the zone remained uncertain, and some models and predictions suggested that the noosphere damage might gradually heal on its own, the crack in reality slowly closing over centuries as the distortions worked their way out of the system. Under this optimistic scenario, the anomalies would become less frequent and less severe. The mutant population would decline as radiation levels dropped and the reality warping effects faded, and eventually the area might be safe for resettlement, though not in the lifetimes of anyone currently living. Other predictions were far darker, and these models suggested that the noosphere crack was fundamentally unstable and might actually expand over time, even without consciousness actively working to contain it. Under worst-case scenarios, the zone could grow to encompass Kiev, then spread further, potentially affecting surrounding countries, and eventually the whole planet. This would mean the end of civilization as humanity knew it, as reality itself became unreliable, and areas of corrupted physics made agriculture, industry, and organized society impossible. Most experts believed the truth lay somewhere between these extremes. The zone would likely remain stable at roughly its current size for the foreseeable future, neither healing nor expanding dramatically. The phenomena within it would continue to pose dangers and challenges, and anomalies would shift and new ones would form. Emissions would occur periodically, and mutants would reproduce and evolve. Artifacts would continue to be created, and the social and factional dynamics among the stalker population would change as individuals died, retired, or were replaced by newcomers with different ideas and goals. The zone would be a permanent feature of the world, a reminder of what happened when humanity reached too far beyond its understanding, but not an immediate existential threat requiring urgent action. This assessment allowed governments and international organizations to take a measured, long-term approach to zone management, rather than having to devote enormous resources to immediate crisis response. The human stories that emerged from the zone were as varied as the people who entered it. Some stalkers accumulated significant wealth and retired to live comfortably outside the zone, though many found they could not adjust to normal life and eventually returned. Others died within days or weeks of entering, victims of their own inexperience, bad luck, or poor judgment. A few became legendary figures, known throughout the zone for specific accomplishments or characteristics. Veterans who had survived for years developed almost supernatural reputations among newer stalkers, spoken of with respect and sometimes with superstitious awe. The reality was usually less dramatic than the legends suggested, but there was truth in the idea that long-term survival in the zone required a combination of skill, knowledge, and something harder to define, an ability to read the environment and make correct decisions under pressure that separated those who lived from those who died. The artifacts recovered from the zone continued to command high prices in the black markets that existed in Kyiv, Moscow, and other cities around the world. Wealthy collectors, scientific institutions, and various government agencies all sought specific artifacts for different purposes. Some artifacts were valued for their scientific interest, as objects that violated known physical laws and might provide insights into new physics or technologies. Others were prized by collectors simply for their rarity and uniqueness, status symbols more than functional items. A few artifacts found legitimate uses in medical equipment or industrial processes where their unusual properties could be exploited. The trade in artifacts was dangerous, not just because obtaining them required entering the zone, but because possessing them was illegal, meaning traders and buyers operated outside the law and had no recourse if they were cheated or robbed. Within academic and scientific communities, the zone became a subject of intense but often frustrating study. Papers and research projects examining various aspects of the phenomena proliferated, but the quality of evidence was often questionable. Direct observation was difficult and dangerous, and equipment malfunctioned or produced inconsistent results. The shifting, unpredictable nature of anomalies meant that reproducible experiments were nearly impossible, and different research teams studying the same phenomena would report contradictory findings. Some of this inconsistency was due to poor methodology or equipment limitations, but much of it seemed to reflect genuine variability in how the zone, as anomalous effects, manifested. Reality itself was not consistent within the zone, and this fundamental inconsistency made conventional scientific analysis problematic. The psychological and sociological dimensions of the zone also attracted scholarly attention. Researchers studied the stalker community as an example of how social organization emerged in extreme environments with minimal formal governance. The faction system, informal trading networks, and unwritten rules that governed stalker behavior represented a kind of organic social order that developed in response to environmental pressures. Psychologists examined the effects of zone exposure on personality and cognitive function, finding that extended time in the anomalous environment produced measurable changes in how people thought and perceived reality. Some of these changes might be protective adaptations, enhanced sensitivity to environmental cues, and improved threat assessment. Others seemed maladaptive, paranoia, dissociation, and, in extreme cases, a kind of psychic contamination where individuals began to exhibit abilities similar to the Zone's mutant controllers, though far weaker and less controlled. The Zone's existence also influenced popular culture in the regions around it and eventually worldwide. Books, films, and games based on or inspired by the Chernobyl zone became a distinct genre. Some of these works attempted documentary realism, presenting the zone and stalker life as accurately as possible based on accounts from those who had been there. Others used the zone as a setting for more fantastical stories, exaggerating its dangers and mysteries for dramatic effect. The line between fact and fiction became blurred as the real zone itself was so strange and anomalous that realistic depictions often seemed like fantasy to those unfamiliar with the actual conditions. Stalkers sometimes complained that popular depictions misrepresented their lives, making the zone seem either more romantic and adventurous or more uniformly horrific than the complex reality they experienced. Through all of this, the fundamental questions posed by the zone's existence remained unresolved. What was the appropriate response to a disaster that could not be undone and might not be fully containable? How should humanity balance the risks of studying the zone against the potential benefits of understanding it? What ethical obligations existed toward the stalkers who entered the zone by choice, and the mutants who had no choice about their transformation? Was the zone a warning that certain types of research should never be conducted, or was it a challenge that human ingenuity would eventually overcome? These questions had no simple answers, and different individuals and groups came to different conclusions based on their values, experiences, and understanding of the situation. The zone stood as a testament to human ambition, to our ability to fundamentally alter reality through our actions, both intentionally and accidentally. The Soviet scientists who created consciousness had genuinely believed they were working toward a noble goal, bringing about world peace by transcending the limitations of individual consciousness. They had pursued this goal with intelligence, dedication, and sophisticated understanding of consciousness, theory, and practical neuroscience. Yet their work had produced not peace, but catastrophe, not enlightenment, but horror. The zone was their monument, a permanent reminder that good intentions and technical sophistication were not sufficient to prevent disaster when dealing with forces as fundamental as the noosphere and the nature of reality itself. For those who survived the zone, whether by living in it long-term or by entering briefly and leaving forever, the experience marked them indelibly. They carried memories of beauty and terror, of fellowship found in the most unlikely circumstances, of confronting their own mortality and discovering what they were truly capable of when pushed to their limits. Some wished they had never entered the zone, seeing only the trauma and loss it had inflicted. Others, paradoxically, saw their time in the zone as the most meaningful period of their lives, when everything was stripped down to essentials and every day was an achievement. Both perspectives had validity, and the zone was terrible, and it was transformative, often simultaneously. It reduced life to survival, while also clarifying what truly mattered. It showed humanity at its worst in the brainwashed monolith soldiers and predatory bandits, and at its best in the stalkers who helped each other survive, and the scientists who risked themselves to understand the phenomena for the benefit of all. The complete history of the Stalker and universe, from the original 1986 disaster through the secret Soviet experiments and the creation of consciousness, the catastrophic 2006 expansion, and the development of the modern zone with its factions and conflicts, to the ultimate destruction of consciousness and the uncertain future that followed, spans decades and involves thousands of individual stories. Each stalker who entered the zone, each researcher who studied it, each military officer who tried to contain it, each government official who made policy decisions about it, all of them contributed to the larger history of how humanity dealt with a catastrophe largely of its own making. The Zone's story is not finished, and as long as the anomalous effects persist, as long as stalkers continue to enter, seeking fortune or knowledge, as long as the fundamental questions about its nature and future remain unresolved, the history continues to be written. New factions may emerge, and new discoveries may be made. The balance of power within the zone may shift, and the anomalies may intensify or fade. All of these possibilities remain open, creating an ongoing narrative that connects past decisions to present circumstances and future consequences. What remains clear is that the zone, in all its terrible magnificence, has become a permanent part of human history and geography. It cannot be ignored or forgotten, and it demands response. Whether that response is scientific study, military containment, humanitarian assistance, or simply individual stalkers seeking their destinies in its irradiated forests and ruined cities. The zone is a mirror reflecting human nature, showing our capacity for both creation and destruction, for both cooperation and conflict, for both transcendence and corruption. It is a laboratory where the boundaries of reality and consciousness are tested daily, and it is a graveyard where thousands have died pursuing various goals. It is a birthplace where new forms of life and new possibilities emerge from the corrupted physics and twisted noosphere. It is all of these things, and none of them capture its full complexity. The zone simply is a fact of existence that must be accepted and dealt with, a challenge that will occupy humanity for generations to come, and a reminder that our actions have consequences far beyond what we can foresee or control. The complete history of the Stalker and universe is ultimately a history of learning these truths, often at terrible cost, and trying to find ways to live with realities that should not exist but undeniably do.